With a deep longing in his heart, he opened his eyes once again and almost instantly sequeled in his shock. He was no longer sitting against the oak tree in the village border. He was now standing in a lush green sea of grass. The sounds of the night creatures were no longer playing in his ears. Instead, the repeated buzzing of the cicadas and the synonymous cackling of the crows reverberated in his ears. These were the meadows he had longed to see, a sight for which he had waited his entire unfortunate life. He waded his way through the knee-high grass. On the yonder, a house came into view. A wooden two-storied farmhouse with a beautiful porch leading to a gravel landing stood basking in the sunlight. The old man walked towards the house, unable to believe that he was standing in front of a house that resembled his ancestral home. He walked up to the porch and stopped, gazing at the magnificent building, whose polished wooden walls gleamed in the sunlight. As he came closer to the house, an old memory resurfaced in his mind, the memory of his father, the most loving father anyone could ever have. It was a pity he did not have a faithful son. The old man, how gruesomely he had beaten his father when he was a young man to gain hold over the ancestral home. His father had wanted to preserve the house, believing it to be a mark of his ancestry. But the old man had never paid heed to his thoughts. He wanted to sell the house to a promoter who was willing to pay quite a hefty sum. So the old man beat his father into submission and then threw him out of the house. At that time, the old man could do anything for money. And that was his sin, greed. That greed had led him to becoming just like his father, homeless and abandoned by his own people. As he stood in front of the house, recalling these memories, he couldn't help but feel an unbearable cold grip him. Very soon, a freezing cold began prickling his skin. He felt a freezing pain affix him to the ground. He looked hither and thither for the source of this unbearable cold, but all he saw was the green grass glistening in the sunlight. He found himself slowly growing more and more immobile. The cold had frozen him to the ground. His feet had gone numb long ago. Now he could no longer feel his hands. The piercing cold had started spreading across his face, making quick work of his eyes. He found his gaze fixed towards the wooden house, unable to move a single atom on his body, unable to free himself from the bonds which had grasped him, and unable to embrace the warmth of the sunlight. But there was something else, something hidden deep in his conscience. There was a word for it: guilt. It was a feeling the old man had hidden in the dark corners of his heart. But now, looking at his house, that feeling had resurfaced along with the countless memories. That guilt for what he had done, for his greed. This eternal guilt began tearing him up from inside. It had all begun with just a simple feeling of sadness. Now, it had amounted to this massive guilt. Repeatedly, again and again, the images of his father begging him to leave the house alone, the bloodied face of his beloved father when he was beaten to death by his only son for inheritance. That impression of betrayal on his face began flashing before his eyes. He screamed in pain, but nothing came out of his mouth. His mouth had been sewn shut by the piercing cold, the cold of his own greed. He could only wallow in silence, regret his decisions, and stand in that green meadow, affixed, unable to move for an eternity, as his guilt shattered his consciousness into countless tiny pieces. An eternity he will spend in yonder foreign land, wallowing for his sins, repenting for his mistakes, frozen by his own greed, and being torn up by his own guilt.